Welcome to a very special episode of In Response To. I'm Jason Bonsall. This is episode 29 in response to certain claims of racism. This is a challenging episode for me to make. I feel like I'm really sticking my neck out in doing so, but hey, this is a show about ideas and important ideas at that. So I think I should at least be forthcoming with where I stand. In this episode, I'm going to just read a paper that I wrote for my final. It was the last final I wrote in my master's program. And my program was called Ethics and Applied Philosophy, which is in the philosophy department, of course. And if you've been in a philosophy department on a college campus in the past few years, you'll know that environment is extremely to the left on the political spectrum and the social spectrum, let's say. You're not going to find too many politically conservative people in that environment. And I'm not politically conservative, but I'm also not as far to the extreme left as a lot of the students and faculty in a philosophy department. So I don't quite fit in so well anymore with those kinds of folks. And I found in my final semester, I had just become so pushed down and burned out on being in that situation that I mostly just kept my mouth shut and just waited for it to be over because it wasn't worth ruffling any feathers. I was just trying to get out of there with my degree and be done with it. But I guess I just couldn't help myself because in the end, when it came time to write this final, I figured, you know what? All semester I've listened to these people in an echo chamber agree about racism everywhere where I just didn't see it. And I feel like I'm finally going to write something to challenge this. And so I did. And it was a trying time, for the weeks I was writing it and getting it totally finished. I had a lot of second guessing in my head about, did I make a huge mistake here? Should I have just done something that wasn't so challenging and just got out of here with my whole reputation intact, I guess. Well, I submitted it, and to my great shock, I got an 89 on it, which, okay, good enough for me. I didn't really care at that point what my grade was. I just wanted to graduate. Although the professor gave me nothing but negative remarks, like really terrible remarks in response to this paper, which it wasn't surprising because I know what she's about. And I knew that this paper was going to be the antithesis of everything she said that entire semester. But you just don't generally get all negative comments from a professor on your paper. I mean, I didn't. I mean, I was a fairly successful writer, I thought. So I had never seen that before. But then to read all these negative comments and nothing but negative comments and still see my grade was an 89, it baffled me. I was asking myself, what do you have to do to fail? But anyway, here's the paper. I want to share it with you. I called it A Message to Leftists, signed Concerned. Introduction. I think I want what you want, leftists. Or rather, I want what I think you should want. A world in which superficial differences between groups of people is recognized but not hierarchized. A world in which race no longer serves as a barrier to entry. This allows, however, for moral differences to be hierarchized, even when moral choices seem to be divided primarily down racial lines as a matter of fact. Immoral acts must be recognized and condemned irrespective of the race of the offender or the victim in order that we might decrease racism and the factors that contribute to it. A leftist is one who denies or obfuscates this claim, as seen herein. I distinguish superficial features and choices from moral choices by adhering to a utilitarian ethic. Actions that are decided based on preference alone and do not interfere with the interests of others are strictly superficial and ought not be a cause for moral hierarchizing. Examples of superficial choices that I mean to remove from the reach of moral hierarchizing include, but are not limited to, styles of dress, other visual expression, manner of speech, and preference in music. Superficial features, also exempt from moral hierarchizing, include, but are not limited to, skin tone, vocal timbre, and hair texture. Actions that interfere with the interests of others, though, have moral worth and not only can be hierarchized, but ought to be. Historical events have led to whites enjoying many socioeconomic advantages and minority groups suffering the reverse. These disparities need to be corrected, but ignoring immoral behavior, no matter the identity of the agent and no matter how culturally specific the action, is not the best way to do so. This paper will sound controversial in ways I do not mean it to be. That's not to deny my intent to be confrontational in some ways, however. For instance, being a utilitarian, I am some kind of supremacist. I'm not a white supremacist, but an action supremacist. Some acts really are bad and worth getting rid of, even if they're considered cultural practices. Those to whom I respond herein, those I call leftists, do not grant this point, instead defending the actions of blacks and vilifying the actions of whites simply as a matter of race and no matter the ethical merits of those actions. The response to my work should not be an indignant assertion that blacks have had it worse. I agree, but this is not a competition to crown the most victimized. As a work of applied philosophy, it is an effort to minimize victimization. To achieve this goal, we must be honest about contributions to the problem, from wherever they may come, and correct actions that tend to prevent success in this endeavor. Racism and race. First, to define racism as I understand it. For this, I'm satisfied to use Merriam-Webster's first definition, which is a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Recognize that this definition describes a belief. Racism, in my view, is not something found in every white American by definition, no matter his conscious beliefs, as some of the strongest notions suggest. Nor is it something to be discovered in someone's subconscious by measuring his responses to psychological tests. The most questionable word in this definition is, I think, primary. Its inclusion leaves quite a wide berth for race to determine human traits and capacities. When it comes to capacities, though, race plays zero role as a determinant, and, as for determining human traits, the contribution is merely superficial, which is to say it has no bearing on moral status. When we shun the otherwise appropriate application of certain superficial descriptors because they're used to describe a person of a particular race, we run the risk of imagining racism where none exists. Jennifer Stover identifies the use of several adjectives such as bronze in describing singer-actress Lena Horne as instantiations of colorblind racism. This exemplifies colorblind racism for Stover because by using these words, the authors of such descriptions perpetuated a 1930s racial divide. The problem with colorblindness, on Stover's account, is it pretends to solve a problem that it only obscures. I agree that this has been and can still be a problem, but without any intent to use these adjectives as code words for an implicit racism, I argue that such an author must be absolved. To describe someone's color as bronze when, in fact, her color looks very much like bronze is not and should not be considered racist by definition. Without denying that certain descriptions of superficial differences have been used in history to nefarious ends, we can recognize that merely acknowledging differences can be done without accompanying problematic value judgments. Paul Taylor sees the problem of racism to be its, quote, unethical disregard for people who belong to a particular race. Disregard, in this context, means the withholding of respect, concern, goodwill, or care from members of a race. End quote. He describes three kinds of racist. External racists dislike people with certain traits that are believed to be a condition of membership in a certain race. Internal racists simply dislike members of a certain race. And the indirect racist, he says, quote, might not be thinking about races and their members at all, end quote, when expressing disregard. He continues, quote, disregard can target the members of a race when it disproportionately or reliably affects the members of a race quite apart from anyone's conscious intentions. This is what I mean by indirect racism, end quote. And this is where I think leftists are currently lost. If, as a matter of fact, members of a certain race are disproportionately responsible for, say, violent crime, then members of that race will be and should be disproportionately and reliably affected by the enforcement of the law. This is not disregard or indirect racism or any kind of racism. This is respect, concern, goodwill, and care for the victims of that community. I am perfectly willing to admit that the law in America is in some ways racist. Leftists must admit that law enforcement, in this case, is not. I also need to explain what I mean by race, and white, and black. I simply mean what 999 out of 1,000 Americans mean when identifying someone's race. And 999 out of 1,000 times, their identification will be accepted by all involved. I do not offer a comprehensive definition of race because the solution to the problem I'm pointing to requires no such definition. This colloquial understanding, imperfect as it is, will suffice for my purpose and allows me to describe someone as white or black without any reference to moral value. The art and the logic. John McWhorter sees the problem as I do. White people are lost and afraid. Lost in not knowing what to make of an extremely complex and ever-shifting landscape of race theory. Afraid of saying or doing anything that will have them labeled racist for reasons unknown. This has led to a fashion in virtue signaling, as those 999 out of 1,000 who are uninitiated in the nuances of race theory try to avoid opaque taboos. In doing this, many people look for any eloquent argument that offers the greatest safeguard, which is to say, most defends blacks and vilifies whites. McWhorter says that in the protective position being sought, quote, the art matters as much as the logic, end quote. We agree that this has led to a poorly calibrated scattershot in the efforts to find and eliminate racism. Rappers 1, philosophers 0. Stover cites Frederick Douglass's testimony of whites demeaning slave songs as meaningless noise as an example of what she calls the sonic color line. The sonic color line is a social construction built around racial groups as a hierarchical boundary in which members' sounds are supposed to match their racial identity. How better to erase this line than to invite members of the ignorant culture, whites, to participate in the practices of other groups? Google calls rap, quote, a type of popular music of U.S. black origin in which words are recited rapidly and rhythmically over a pre-recorded, typically electronic instrumental backing, end quote. Nothing in this definition implies that rap can only be legitimately practiced by black people. Why, then, do my colleagues in philosophy admonish the white rapper Eminem? When asked, their responses include words like oppression and cultural appropriation. One philosopher told me that Eminem should produce music, or if he must rap, feature black artists on his songs in order to further their careers. Never mind that he already does both of these things, why should he be kept from pursuing his passion as he likes, based on the color of his skin? I thought we wanted to destroy such barriers, but somehow for philosophers, this aspiration does not travel on a two-way street. Participation in previously culturally specific practices need not be an expression of disrespect toward that culture. Shows like American Idol, X Factor, and The Voice are replete with people singing songs made famous by people of other races. It's beautiful. I love when a black person sings a previously white property and vice versa. I take it as a sign of progress. Why should this be vilified when whites perform rap? Fortunately, outside the philosophy classroom, it isn't. Wiz Khalifa calls Eminem, quote, one of the greatest rappers, end quote. Raekwon says he is, quote, a master. I don't care what color he is, end quote. The rappers have the right idea. As much as any other activity, sports gave white kids black heroes. And it wasn't the Negro Leagues that did it. It was Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier of the National League in 1947 and winning Most Valuable Player in 49 that exposed millions of white fans to the truth of racial equality. Baseball historians say Robinson was not the best player the Negro Leagues had to offer, but as long as white baseball fans saw those leagues as alien, none of those players would receive their proper respect. By mingling players of these races, whites learned to appreciate players who looked and played differently than the white norm. Everyone benefited. Music has the power to do the same, but as long as rap is segregated, it will not intrigue enough white ears to pay attention. Wearing a jersey of a differently raced player or admiring an athlete is one thing. The importance of Jackie Robinson cannot be overstated, but singing the songs of another race is much more intimate and must be encouraged. The soft bigotry of low expectations. Melinda Newman of HitFix reviewed the video for Rihanna's Pour It Up by saying, quote, it's a dimly lit video equivalent of a Playboy photo spread that is meant to serve the very same purpose for the boys and men who view it. I'm trying to be discreet here. And we're all supposed to scrape and bow and talk about how artfully it's shot and pretend that it's so very empowering for her to show off her body this way, end quote. Yet in the classroom, leftists praise Rihanna for the video's depiction of female strength and independence. It takes a degree in philosophy to believe that stripping is a power play. What would be the result, I wonder, if a man had put this position forward? When a woman says it, male leftists feel compelled to accept it. They cannot disagree with a woman philosopher on gender issues. I cannot believe that in a world without it, and all else being equal, these same defenders would be clamoring for such content as a much-needed display of female empowerment. This interpretation seems to me nothing more than making the best of a bad situation because it has become doubly unacceptable to leftists to criticize a black female. The example of Rihanna, I grant, is merely superficial, but it betrays an unwillingness of leftists to criticize so-called black culture, despite the fact that these leftists would never willingly adopt such practices. This is the soft bigotry of low expectations. The problem is in thinking truly immoral acts like those to follow are acceptable when performed by minorities, as if to say, that life is good enough for them, but I would never do it. In Black Noise, Trisha Rose does not explicitly defend graffiti and fighting in the context of hip-hop, but her tone is entirely forgiving, if not laudatory, of these practices. An unenviable social and economic situation does not prevent graffiti from being vandalism, nor does it make violence a respectable method of expressing one's identity. My assessment does not deny any historical causes for the condition of life for those to whom Rose refers, but holding history as overly determinative threatens to compromise black agency. Are black folks predestined by history or biology to be violent primarily to each other? Of course not. This is a concern I share with Glenn Lowry. There can be no black agency if all black sins are the fault of white people and a white supremacist history, influential though those factors are. Improving the lives of those who suffer most requires an admission and an address of what Lowry calls the enemy within, and not an obfuscation of when vandalism counts as vandalism, based on who commits it and against whom. In Blues Legacies and Black Feminism, Angela Davis celebrates the willingness of Bessie Smith and Zora Neale Hurston to stay true in their representations of the traditions of hoodoo against pressures from Eurocentric biases in their fields. But when people hold an honest belief that salt possesses magical powers, for example, they remain vulnerable to unforeseeable dangers and manipulation. I understand that there can be value in maintaining a group history and culture, but tendencies toward tribalism can also be pernicious and outright dangerous. Endorsement of belief systems like hoodoo by cultural icons is effective and irresponsible. But criticism or pressure to shift away from such things is vilified simply because it comes from a Eurocentric source. When criticism is vilified by Western leftists who know better for themselves, this is, again, a soft bigotry of low expectations. But the big one is crime, and the biggest of those, murder. A great deal has been made of late about the killings of black men by police. While terrible, obviously, leftists have been troublingly obscurant about why some of these killings have occurred. We have a crime problem in the black community. We must be honest about that. In 2008, the homicide victimization rate for blacks was 6 times that of whites. The homicide offender rate was 7 times that of whites. And this after rates had plummeted from what they were in the 1990s. With so much police attention being called for in black communities, and the unfortunate fact that some people will be killed in police encounters, especially when in response to violent crimes, we should expect a disproportionate percentage of police killings to have black victims. This, of course, does not give license to ascribe morally relevant biological traits to blacks. It does, however, explain how police kill blacks at a rate disproportionate to the black part of the population without the cops being racist. But leftists have made it nearly impossible to speak soberly about this. We are not supposed to acknowledge, for instance, that white victims of homicide, 12%, are 3 times as likely as black ones, 4%, to have been killed by police. The other 96% of black homicide victims are almost all killed by other blacks. We are also supposed to ignore Roland Fryer's study of 10 cities showing that, quote, officers were more likely to fire their weapons without having first been attacked when the suspects were white, end quote. If we want to solve the horrific problem of murder in black communities, which we clearly do, we cannot pretend the source is a racist law enforcement institution. We cannot fail to protect black citizens from each other simply because the offenders and victims are black. We cannot harbor a soft bigotry of low expectations by refusing to place blame where it belongs. Conclusion. I've been on the left for as long as I've had a political identity. If someone like me is to be called a racist by the lights of leftists, then they need to be more discerning with their application of this label. There are real racists out there to confront. If even I am seen as an enemy, these leftists will find themselves in a very cold and lonely world in which many would-be allies turn tail in the face of unwarranted accusations and berating. With this paper, I have asked leftists to recalibrate their sights in aiming at racism. You don't need me to tell you it's still a problem. Maybe it always will be. But we can do better in solving what we can by being honest about where the problem lies. I do not say stop pushing for progress. I do say the effort must point in the right direction. We must also be clear about what the goal line looks like, so not to fight an endless war. It will undoubtedly be said by race theorists that I do not have a grasp on the work being done in this field, that I lack nuance, and probably far worse. That may be, but the same is true of 999 out of 1,000 Americans who, unlike after reading the real work being done in race theory, can actually understand and relate to my position, and who will help decrease racism and victimization by following my advice. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your comments.